I remember that morning, not because it was special, but precisely because it was ordinary. Early April, 1986. The city hadn't fully woken up yet. At the bus stops, people stood with half-closed eyes, holding their bags as if they contained their entire lives. I watched them through the windshield and felt a strange lightness, as if I had already stepped aside, even before I started moving. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, not because there was no one to say goodbye to, but because I didn't want to explain. I had decided long ago I would go somewhere I couldn't be heard, where no voice could come between me and the text. My goal was simple: a cabin in the forest not far from Pripyat. An old place, rarely mentioned. The road was bad, there was no signal, and that was exactly what made it perfect. I deliberately didn't turn on the radio. I wanted the first hours of silence to begin while I was still on the road. There is a difference between silence and muteness. Silence is a choice. Muteness is an absence. The city was slowly letting me go. Buildings grew farther apart. There were fewer people. The road seemed to dissolve into space. I caught myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary. Not out of nostalgia, more like a precaution, as if I needed to make sure no one was following me. In the trunk was everything that was meant to become my world for a year. Canned food, grains, water, medicine, warm clothes, paper, ink. I counted the days, calculated calories. I was certain it would be enough. When the asphalt ended and the wheels first hit the dirt road, I felt something inside me tighten. The forest moved closer. The trees stood dense, without gaps. Their trunks stretched upward, as if the sky was the only thing that interested them. At some point, it felt like the road had narrowed. Not physically, emotionally. As if I were entering a place where turning back was not customary. I stopped the car, got out, listened. The forest was silent, not alert, not hostile, just silent. I got back into the car and drove on, not knowing that this was the last moment when I still had the choice to turn back. The cabin didn't appear right away. The road simply ended, and from there I had to go on foot. I carried my backpack, and every step sounded too loud, as if the forest wasn't used to human presence. The building stood slightly apart, among trees that grew too close to one another. It felt as though they had deliberately gathered around it, hiding it from prying eyes. The cabin was old. The wood had darkened with time. The roof sagged, but it didn't leak. The windows were small and cloudy, as if they didn't want to reveal what was inside. I stopped in front of the door and held my hand on the handle for a moment. Not out of fear. More because of the feeling that I wasn't just entering a space, but stepping into a different rhythm of life. Inside, it was cool. The air was still, heavy, like in a room that had been closed for a long time. The smell of old wood, dampness, and something else. Familiar, but hard to define. Maybe ash. Maybe time. I set my things by the wall and immediately lit the stove. It accepted the fire reluctantly. The logs crackled as if arguing with one another, but after a few minutes, the warmth began to spread through the room, slowly, without hurry. I took a closer look at the cabin. A table, a bed, a shelf. Nothing extra. Nothing that could distract me. That was exactly what I wanted. Outside the window stood the forest. It was close. Too close. I couldn't see the horizon. Only trees stretching upward, blocking the sky. I stepped outside to look around. The ground was still cold after winter. The snow hadn't fully melted. In some places it lay in patches, as if unwilling to leave. That's when I noticed the first strange sensation. Not an event. A sensation. It was too quiet, Not the kind of quiet a forest usually has. There's always something moving. Birds, insects, small sounds. Here, nothing. I listened. It felt as though the silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It seemed to occupy space, as if it were a presence of its own. I went back inside, trying not to dwell on it. The human mind loves to exaggerate, especially in unfamiliar conditions. I unpacked my things, laid out paper on the table, prepared a simple meal. Everything was ordinary. Routine calms you. It creates an illusion of control. When darkness fell, I sat at the table and tried to write. The words came easily, as if they had been waiting. But several times I caught myself stopping and looking toward the door. For no reason. Just because. Night came quickly. Outside the windows it was dark, but the forest didn't disappear. I felt its presence even when I couldn't see it. I lay down on the bed, leaving a small light on. The stove was still giving off warmth. It felt like everything was under control. And yet, before sleep, I wrote the first line in my journal, one that had nothing to do with the book. This place is not empty. I just don't yet know what fills it. I turned off the light, and the silence returned. The first days passed evenly. So evenly that I almost stopped noticing them. I woke up, lit the stove, sat at the table, and wrote. The words came without resistance. It felt as though this place had been created for them. Nothing interfered. Nothing distracted me. And that was what began to worry me. A forest is never absolutely stable. Something is always changing. Light, wind, sound. Here, everything remained the same. I noticed it on the fourth or fifth day. I stepped outside one morning and realized I couldn't remember seeing a single bird here. Not that day. Ever. I listened. It was quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet. That evening, I woke up in the middle of the night. No sleep in my eyes, no anxiety. I simply opened my eyes and understood that I was no longer asleep. The stove had long gone cold. The cabin was chilly. But that wasn't the reason. I felt that someone was outside. Not by the door, not by the window. Just outside. I lay still and listened. My heart was beating slowly, evenly. No panic. That was what felt strange. I got up, went to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. The forest stood exactly as it did during the day. Dark, dense, silent. No movement, no shadows. I opened the door. Cold air touched my face. I stepped onto the threshold. The ground beneath my feet was solid, real. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for the sensation to fade. It didn't. I went back inside and closed the door. Only then did I realize that I hadn't heard my own footsteps outside. No crunch, no rustle. In my journal I wrote, "This place does not fall silent. It simply does not speak the way we are used to." The following nights were similar. I woke up at almost the same time. I didn't dream. I heard no sounds. But there was always that feeling, as if I had interrupted someone's presence. One night, I woke up and realized I had been staring at the ceiling for a long time. Too long for it to be normal. I couldn't remember when I had opened my eyes. Maybe I never closed them. During the day, I tried to rationalize everything. Fatigue, isolation, adaptation. The human mind doesn't like silence. It starts to invent things. But then I noticed something else. My writing had grown darker. Not in content, in tone. The characters spoke less often. Dialogues became shorter. Descriptions grew sparse, as if the text itself was avoiding unnecessary words. I didn't remember planning that. A new line appeared in the journal. I no longer write the way I used to, and I'm not sure this is my choice. That night, I woke up again, and this time, I was certain. I did not wake up alone. I stopped noticing the days passing, not all at once, gradually. At first, I still counted them, mentally, without a calendar. Then I stopped. Numbers lost their meaning. Morning and evening became the only difference I could still feel in my body. I woke up at the same time every day. At least, it seemed that way. The light outside the window was always the same. Not bright, not dim, as if someone were deliberately holding it at a fixed level. I began to suspect that the sun moved differently here. Winter arrived without warning. One morning I opened the door, and the world was white. Snow lay thick and even, without footprints. So even it looked unnatural. I took a few steps. The snow crunched under my feet, but the sound vanished almost immediately, as if the trees had swallowed it. I went back into the cabin with the uneasy feeling that it was better not to stay outside for long. A calendar hung on the wall. I hadn't paid attention to it for a long time. When I finally stepped closer, I saw it was stuck on October. I was certain I had turned it forward long ago. I took the calendar off the wall. The paper was cold and slightly damp, as if it hadn't been inside the cabin but somewhere outdoors. I flipped the pages to December, hung it back up, and stepped away. The next day it was showing October again. I didn't do anything about it. Not because I hadn't noticed, but because I didn't want to check. I kept writing. Pages multiplied. But sometimes, rereading what I'd written, I found lines I didn't remember. They were mine stylistically. The rhythm, the words, everything was familiar. But the moment of writing them didn't exist. At times it felt as though the ink on older pages grew darker with each passing day, as if the text wasn't simply resting on the paper, but slowly growing into it. I caught myself writing faster when it was dark outside, as if night made the process easier. During the day, the words came more slowly, with resistance. I didn't dwell on it. Writers always find strange patterns. At night, I woke up more often, sometimes with the feeling that I'd slept for a very long time, sometimes as if I hadn't slept at all. There was no clock in the cabin. I had deliberately refused to have one. Now I regretted it. One time I woke up and realized the cabin was warm. Too warm for a night without a fire in the stove. I got up, stepped closer, and saw that the ashes were still warm. I didn't remember adding any logs. I began leaving small marks, scratches on the table, dots in the margins of the journal, simple signs to check whether anything changed without me. Sometimes they disappeared. Sometimes new ones appeared. I stopped being certain that all my days belonged only to me. A note appeared in the journal. Time here does not pass. It repeats. Or it waits. I was sitting at the table staring at the paper when it suddenly struck me. I didn't know what month it was, and that frightened me more than the silence. I understood that the book was coming to an end before I wrote the final page. It wasn't a decision, more a sensation. The story no longer demanded continuation. The characters had stopped moving forward. It was as if they were waiting, not for development, for an ending. I wrote more slowly than before. Every sentence felt final, as if nothing was meant to follow it. A strange silence filled the cabin, not the one I had grown used to. It didn't press in on me. It observed, like someone who knows the ending and patiently waits for you to reach it on your own. I began waking before dawn, not because of sounds, simply earlier than usual. The light outside the window was gray, hesitant. The forest stood in fog, and the trees looked flat, as if drawn. Those hours were the best for writing. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that the lines appeared faster than I could comprehend them. My hand moved on its own, not chaotically, confidently. I didn't stop. When I reread what I had written, it felt right. Too right, without doubt, without excess, as if the text had existed long before and I was merely transferring it onto paper. Once, I came across a paragraph describing a feeling of complete isolation. Very precisely. Too precisely. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember when I had written it. I couldn't. Winter was slowly retreating. The snow outside the window grew gray and heavy. A damp smell appeared in the cabin. I opened the door more often, but the forest remained just as silent, as if it were waiting. I wrote the final pages almost without breaks. Food lost its taste. Sleep lost its depth. I existed in a narrow space between the table and the bed, and when I finally put down the period, nothing happened. I sat there, staring at the page. The ink had already dried. The dot was small, unremarkable. It didn't look like the end of something significant. But I felt relief. Deep, almost physical. As if something had let go. I closed the notebook and pushed it away from me. For the first time in a long while, I didn't want to write anything. I took the journal, the one where I recorded not the text, but myself, and stared at the blank page for a long time. Then I wrote, "The book is finished. I've done what I came here to do." My hand didn't stop. Tomorrow I will go to the city. I need to see people, to make sure they exist. I reread those lines several times. There was something strange about them, as if I wasn't doubting the city, but the very concept of people. I set the journal aside and lay down on the bed. Sleep came quickly, without dreams. But just before I fell asleep, I became clearly aware of one thing. While I was writing, I was not alone. And now that the book was finished, something had changed. For the first time the entire time, I was looking forward to morning. I left the cabin early. Too early to call it morning. The light was only just beginning to seep through the fog. The forest looked flat, stripped of depth, as if someone had removed one of its dimensions. I didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to say goodbye, but because I was sure that if I did, the feeling would return. The backpack was light. I took only the essentials. For the first time in a long while, I felt a strange clarity. The book was finished. The purpose fulfilled. Now, back to people. I repeated this to myself, like a phrase that's easy to forget. The road appeared suddenly. The asphalt was old, cracked. Grass had grown through it. Not chaotically, but in strips, as if someone had deliberately allowed it to grow exactly there. I walked slowly, not from fatigue. I just didn't want to hurry. The closer I came to the city, the more the air changed. It grew heavier, thicker. I stopped and took a deep breath. The air tasted of metal. It was quiet all around. But now it was a different kind of silence, not a forest one. It was flat, open, without cover. In such silence you usually hear distant sounds, cars, voices, something that confirms the existence of people. There was nothing. I passed an old sign. The paint had peeled away. The city's name was still readable, but it looked as though no one had spoken it aloud for a long time. Pripyat. I said the word silently. The farther I walked, the more small details began to unsettle me. Abandoned roadsides. Too even. Bushes. Too dense, as if no one had touched them for a very long time. And yet, not wild, as if the world had stopped mid-process. Several times I caught myself waiting for the sound of an engine. Any engine, even a distant one. I was ready for noise, for voices, for presence. Nothing appeared. As I approached the city, I saw the first buildings. They stood straight, undamaged. The windows were intact. Some were open. It seemed to me that the city had simply stepped out for a few minutes and never came back. I stepped onto the street. The sound of my footsteps echoed too clearly, as if the space were empty and nothing interfered with the sound traveling. I stopped. No movement, no people, no traffic. Even the trash looked as though it had been left behind in a hurry, but not in panic. Things lay where they didn't belong, but without chaos. I felt a strange sensation, not fear, disorientation. The world wasn't behaving the way it should. I went on, looked into a courtyard, then into an entrance hallway. The air inside was stale, cold. The stairs were covered in dust, but not enough to say that no one had been here for a very long time. And that was the worst part. I went back out onto the street and realized that I was standing in the middle of a city that showed no sign of life. I made a note in my journal, standing right there on the sidewalk. I arrived, but it seems I'm late. The only question is, by how much? I lifted my head and looked down the length of the street. And that was when I heard the first sound that did not belong to me. I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. At first I thought I had imagined it. The sound was brief, sharp, as if something alive had suddenly reminded me of its presence, and then immediately vanished. I froze, listening, but the city became empty again. I moved on, slowly, carefully. Now every step I took felt too loud. I turned into a courtyard. A shadow lay between the buildings, dense, almost cold. There was more movement there, not visible, but perceptible, as if the air itself reacted differently to my presence. And then I saw them. At first, one, then two more, then an entire pack. Dogs. They were thin, dirty, with dull coats. They stood at a distance and watched. No barking, no growling. Their eyes showed no fear, and that was unnatural. I took a step back. One of the dogs slowly moved forward. I didn't run. Instinct told me it would be a mistake. I retreated, trying not to make any sudden movements. The dogs followed, keeping their distance. The city no longer felt empty. It simply wasn't human. I saw an open entrance and turned sharply into it. The door creaked so loudly that I flinched. A moment later, barking erupted, now close. I ran inside and shut the door. My heart was beating faster, but my thoughts remained strangely clear. I went up the stairs to the second floor and stopped, pressing myself against the wall. The barking stayed somewhere below, then faded. I stood in the dark stairwell, listening to my own breathing. Dust hung in the air. The stairs were covered in footprints. Old, worn, not fresh, but not too old either. I realized that someone, or something, was in the city, just not the ones I had been looking for. In my journal, I made a short note, my hand shaking. I am not alone, but there are no people here. I didn't know how long I stood there in the darkness. When I finally dared to look out the window, the courtyard was empty. The dogs had vanished as quietly as they had appeared. The city froze again. I sat down on the stairs and, for the first time, truly considered the thought. What if I hadn't returned to civilization, but had come to the place where it used to be? I left the cabin believing that a year of solitude was over, but it seems solitude had simply changed its form. Story to be continued soon.